Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Sherrouse. I'm with the Montana Committee for the Humanities. The Montana Festival of the Book is one of our many presentations. We welcome you here for a little luncheon event that we're going to do. And I'm going to introduce basically Brian Kahn and David Sirota, and then let them go while you eat. We have an hour, and we want to dismiss early enough so that you can get to the next events. So we'll try to knock off around 10 minutes to 1. But we also want to allow for some questions from the audience. So in any case, we thought we'd just start. They're beginning to serve now. David and Brian have graciously consented to fasting during the noon hour, but we will see that they are fed later in the program. So in any case, thank you for coming. We're delighted to see you, and we're going to get started right away. First of all, introductions. Brian Kahn, I'm sure many of you know of him as a radio personality. His Homeground show on public radio is, I think, well known throughout the state. Brian is well known for very insightful, tough interviews, largely dealing with public issues. We have supported his show through the Montana Committee for the Humanities for several years, and it's one of the things that we're very proud to be associated with. Brian will be interviewing our author guest, David Sirota, and I had a copy of the book here, but I took it back. We'll be flashing a copy of the book at you later, but it's called Hostile Takeover. I'm sure many of you are aware of what it's about. Very timely. David is a political commentator, analyst, worked, as I recall, at the one of the committees of the House for some years. So has a bit of an insider's view, has stayed connected with politics both here in Montana as well as nationally, and brings some original insights and a lot of thinking to his topic. So we're very pleased he's with us. I'm going to sit down now and eat so that you can listen to the people that you paid to come and hear. So let me, without further ado, welcome and introduce Brian and David. And they're going to sit up here and talk. Thanks. All right. Excuse me.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. As Mark said, we're not eating till you're finished, so please leave some leftovers on your plates. It's a tight budget operation, and there were no extra lunches for us. By way of preface, the debate about the relationship between business and government goes back to the founders of this country. It's one of the fundamental and most long-standing discussions in America. Alexander Hamilton, as you may remember, was a very eloquent advocate for a very powerful central government, specifically including a central bank. He believed in government by the wealthy, propertied, and well-born, and a federal government with sufficient central power to enact and implement pro-trade, pro-business policies. And he was very effective in his advocacy. Abraham Lincoln took a different view, saying something pretty close to, I didn't have a chance to look up the exact quote, that labor is the superior of capital, labor predated and created capital, and in public policy considerations, labor deserved much the higher consideration. Teddy Roosevelt weighed in later, dealing with the reality of increasingly concentrated private economic power, or as he called it, monopolies and trusts. He felt that excessively concentrated power damaged the benefits to the public that were brought by free markets, and also corrupted governmental policies through excessive influence. One might argue the Republican Party recovered its equilibrium shortly thereafter. I think it was Coolidge who said the business of government is business. That changed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. New Deal concepts. He had some caustic things to say about economic aristocracy. Ronald Reagan weighed in with sort of, I think, the forerunner of deregulation philosophy and what is considered now pro-market concepts, saying something along the lines of government isn't part of the solution, it's part of the problem. And we've seen a lot of policies reducing the role of government or attempting to reduce the role of government. Now, coming late into this debate is this bright young guy, and I hate to say how young this guy is, but he's about half my age, which shows that I'm a slow learner. David Sirota has weighed in with this best-selling book, some weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I don't know how it could be a bestseller with the wimpy title, Hostile Takeover, How Big Money and Corruption Conquered Our Government and How We Can Take It Back. Nevertheless, it has been on the bestsellers list and generated all sorts of commentary, pro and con. And I was hoping that David could be here today and to talk about the book. But there's a little thing you need to know. When I first heard of David Sirota, I was told that he looked a lot like the actor Ben Stiller. Now, I didn't know who the hell Ben Stiller was. You know, I barely can turn on my television. But I was told it was true. And of course, if he looks like Ben Stiller, then Ben Stiller looks like David Sirota, right? Which is good news, because Sirota is right now on a yacht near Tahiti. He bought it with the proceeds from the book, the royalties, and so this is Ben. Good to see you, Ben. Thanks for coming. I hope you can talk about the book. And with that, David Sirota will step up to the mic, and I will begin to ask him some questions, and then we will open it up to you. And those under your napkins, you'll see some questions that are very tough, and I didn't want to ask them, so those are for you.
Well, I just want to say, before we do questions, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank the Festival of the Book for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I'm a little bit hazy right now. I've been working on a campaign, doing a lot of work actually, full-time for Ned Lamont, who some of you who follow politics might know. He's running against Joe Lieberman. And so my brain is sort of filled with Connecticut politics, but what's very interesting about it is that it's one of these races where what I've written about in this book is central to what is going on in that race. It's just an anecdote. When I was driving over here from Helena, where I live, I had to pull over just before Garrison Junction because I got a call from Ned, and we're doing a press event out in Connecticut on the new report that came out today about Jack Abramoff, which was basically the bipartisan Congressional House Government Oversight Committee released a report showing that there were more than 500 individual contacts between Abramoff and top White House officials, including gifts of up to $25,000 given to top White House officials like Karl Rove and Ken Mellman. So I had to pull over at Garrison Junction so the phone didn't go out to go over this report for him to do a press conference with reporters specifically about that issue and how Lieberman has voted against lobbying reform. So the reason I tell you that is because all of the stuff in this book is really, really, I think, central to the ongoing political debate that's happening and intensifying right now before the 2006 election.
Makes you almost wish you were one of those people at the top of the White House. $25,000 goes
would be
a long way
nice.
in Montana. All right, well, let's talk about this. Now, your background is Democratic politics. You worked for Bernie Sanders, who's an independent, but certainly left and center. You worked in Chicago politics, and now you work for Ned Lamont. So somebody might say this book is a partisan book. What would you say to that?
I would say that I don't pretend to be nonpartisan. I don't pretend to say that I'm not for either party. I am a Democrat. I support Democrats. This book is not a Democratic book. You know, you can be a Democrat or a Republican, and you don't have to write a partisan book. The point of the book, as I say in the beginning, is that the problems deal with both parties. And what's funny is that when this book came out, I've been criticized for being simultaneously a partisan Democrat and somebody who hates Democrats. And in fact, perhaps maybe I am both, because there are a lot of Democrats that I really do despise and that are detailed in this book. But the point being is that this book, I wouldn't call it an objective look at the problem, because I'm not objective, but I would say that it is definitely a nonpartisan look at the problem.
Okay, what is the problem? What is the problem? You say how big money and corruption conquered our government. Pretty strong language. So how do you back that up?
Well, what I would say is that the problem is that we no longer have a government that really much pretends to be anything other than big business's personal sidearm. And I want to be clear that, as I say in this book, I don't have a problem with companies, corporations doing whatever they can to make as much money as possible. I find that the entire concept of corporate responsibility, when you hear somebody say that, I kind of look at them like they're crazy, because a corporation has no responsibility to do anything other than make as much money as possible, whether it runs roughshod over me, you, or this society. My problem with this book, the problem that I detail in this book, is that we have a government that is supposed to confine that profit motive to make sure that it doesn't run roughshod over everything else, and that we no longer have a government that plays that referee role. We have a government, I would say, and there's all sorts of details in this book, a government that's sole purpose right now is to help the interests that pay to get a seat at the political table make as much money as possible. And again, I don't blame Microsoft, any company, for making as much money as possible. In fact, executives have a fiduciary legal responsibility to do whatever they can to make as much money as possible. The problem is when you have the people who are supposed to regulate that capitalism not being independent arbiters, not caring about the citizens that they're that elected them, that they're supposed to derive their power from. I would argue that people that are elected leaders are deriving their power from, or behave as if they derive their power from, big money interests, rather than where they really derive their authority from, which is our government and our votes.
Well, okay, let's take a look at this. First of all, I think you'd have to agree that major corporations make a major contribution to the American economy. They employ tens of millions of people. To be successful, they need policies that are pro-business policies. They lobby for those. They support campaigns. Would you deny them that opportunity? What's wrong with that from your perspective?
Well, let me unpack your question. The issue of what is a pro-business policy, let me try to think of some good examples here. Okay, our trade policy in this country. Having no labor, human rights, environmental, or wage protections, that's considered pro-business, right? That's what we're told is pro-business. Well, that's not pro-medium-sized or small business. Forcing our domestic manufacturers to compete against companies that are allowed to exploit slave labor abroad is not a pro-business policy. There's the United States Business Industry Council, which represents medium-sized manufacturers, which is against this kind of trade policy because it's destroying their businesses. What it is a pro-whoever paid to get a seat at the political table in writing that trade pact policy. It is it's pro only for the businesses that have enough money to essentially use our system of legalized bribery to make sure those provisions are stripped away out of our trade policies. That's just an example. Now, so I think that when we hear the term pro-business policy or pro-business ideology, a red flag should go off, because it's one of those terms that's sort of loaded that we don't really think about what it actually means. Now, do I think that companies need to have, or should be able to fund political campaigns? Should they be able to lobby? Look, I think everybody should be able to lobby. I'm not one of these people who thinks that the way to solve the problem of corruption, the scandals that we have, is necessarily lobbying reform, gift ban. All that stuff is fine. The issue is we have a system right now whereby people, when they run campaigns, their campaigns basically have to be funded, except with there are some exceptions, but basically have to be funded with private interests, funded by private interests. So the problem is that we have created a system that gives an incentive to people who know best how to raise money from private interests. And who's got the most money out of all the private interests out there is corporations, companies. Companies are essentially masses of capital to be spent. So my problem is that if you have, with that system, you have a system that's rigged to give a bigger voice to those who have more money. That's why in this book, one of the things I suggest at the end is public financing of elections, is to at least give people who want to run for office the option to not have to rely only on private money.
Let's talk a second. You mentioned global trade. It is a fact of life that multinational corporations, by definition, work around the world. If our government adopted more policies that are less in their interests, the argument would be made, they'll go elsewhere. Other governments are corporate friendly. There's an interesting book called The Age of Extremes by Eric Hobsbawm. I don't know if you read it. He argues that the multinational structure is more powerful than the nation state. So one seems to me can make a pretty rational argument that if the American government didn't have pro-corporate policies, we would be in terrible economic shape. What would you say to that?
Well, there's two things. First and foremost, most companies can't afford to not do business in this country, to not sell products here. We are the biggest consumer market in the world. We do not leverage that power, because that is power. That is American power. That is one of the facets of America being a superpower. We are the biggest consumer market. We do not leverage that power right now for good, either for international good or for our own citizens' good. There's another book out called The Global Class War. I think that's the name of the book. It's by Jeff Foe. It just came out. And he talks about how these policies basically are for an elite, an international elite, whether here or abroad, who basically are at the top of this food chain. What I would say is that we can have a trade policy that leverages the fact that every company in the world wants to sell stuff to Americans. If we say to a company, you have to respect basic environmental laws when you manufacture something in China and then expect to sell it back here, by and large, those companies are going to have to say yes if they're going to be able to be financially competitive. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, let's not pretend for a moment that we have a free trade policy. That's another one of those terms that a red flag should go off. Why do you think these trade policies are thousands of pages long? If we had a free trade policy, it would be 1 page long. It would say, no tariffs, thank you. What is in those thousands of pages? They are protectionist policies for profits. They are policies like the one that was inserted in the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which allows the pharmaceutical industry to artificially inflate prices through patent controls in the developing world. That is a protectionist policy. Our trade policy is one that is only free of provisions that protect ordinary human beings. One example that's very instructive. When CAFTA was being negotiated, when the bill came through the committee, John Kerry, who's now better on trade since running for president, which is also funny. Everybody gets to become a political populist when they're actually running for office. It's funny. Everyone says, "Oh, you can't be a populist." Well, why does everybody become a populist right around election time? Anyway, he offers an amendment that says, in this deal, right now, corporations have an arbitration process if their patent and copyright protections are violated. This amendment that I am offering would afford workers the same arbitration process if their labor and human rights are violated. Voted down. That vote shows you who these trade policies are working for.
Let's talk a little about pharmaceuticals. I interviewed the Vice President for Research of Pfizer, one of the major international drug manufacturers. Their argument was, yes, they lobby, yes, they support candidates, and they need and deserve pro-pharmaceutical policies from the American government if they are to produce these miracle drugs, which we all benefit from. What would you say to that?
Well, first and foremost, your taxpayer dollars are funding 1/3 of all healthcare and pharmaceutical research and development. And you are rewarded for that with the highest prices for pharmaceuticals in the world. So the old argument that the drug companies they invest so much money and it's risky investment, and then when they happen to hit, a drug that everyone needs, they need to make back the profits not only for the investment in that drug, but for all the investments that they made and they never came up with a drug. Okay. Well, why isn't that the case for taxpayers? Why are we investing billions of dollars a year, covering 1/3 of all R&D costs in this country, and we get no return? Our return is in fact the highest prices in the world for drugs that we are subsidizing. There was legislation brought forward to say that when we invest in a drug, the taxpayers, we should be given that drug at a fair and reasonable price. When that research is turned over to the pharmaceutical industry, the bill said that the NIH would have to negotiate contracts with the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that we are offered a fair and reasonable price. Shocker, it was voted down. So that's the first thing, the whole idea that they need to make back their money because they're doing all sorts of R&D. I think they need to be able to make back some of their money, but they shouldn't be allowed to price gouge on the money that we're investing. We deserve a return on our investment. Second thing is, don't fall for the idea that the drug companies are just struggling to get by and, well, they need to make back these returns and, they're spending so much money on R&D. Drug companies, on average, spend far more on marketing and administrative costs, think executive salaries, than they do on research and development. They know they are price gouging. Here's an anecdote how you know that they know they're price gouging. There was one of the big companies, and I can't think of the name of it. I think it was Glaxo, but I could be wrong. One of the big companies in New Jersey sent a memo to its own employees urging them, when they use their company health care benefits, to only buy generic drugs. Now think about that. The pharmaceutical company that sells exorbitantly priced commercial drugs is telling its own employees to please buy generic drugs because the commercial drugs that company itself and other companies are selling are too exorbitantly priced and putting too much of a strain on the company's health plan. Again, there is the evidence that they know they're price gouging and they don't care.
Let's talk in a few minutes that we have left before we go to the audience for questions about what you outline as potential solutions. And I want to preface it by saying we have a First Amendment right supported by the Supreme Court. People have the right to contribute to campaigns. Corporations within certain legal limits have that right. We have the right to hire lobbyists to advocate certain points of view. You're saying it's legalized bribery. The Supreme Court's saying it's First Amendment rights. How do you want to address what you see as this fundamental imbalance? What are you proposing here?
Well, the first thing we need to do is have a public financing system of elections. That's the very first thing. The culprit in all of this is money going into the process with the expectation of legislative favors. That's the culprit. It's not shady lobbyists. It's not all sorts of the scandals that you hear about. Because all of the scandals you hear about, the lobbying stuff, the Jack Abramoff stuff, Jack Abramoff would not be able to be powerful. He would not be able to buy favors from Conrad Burns if he wasn't whispering in Conrad Burns' ear, and yes, what I'm asking you for comes with you can expect to get major campaign contributions from this. The lobbyists, when they whisper in members of Congress's ear, they are listened to as much as they can back up that whisper with financial contributions. So we need to to target money going into a political process that we are supposed to own, and that money coming with the expectations of personal legislative favors. That's different than ideological expectations. Remember that. There is a difference. There are people who give, all over the country who give, and I think this is less of a problem, small donors who give money to candidates based on an ideological agenda. That is far less of a problem than, let's say, Halliburton giving a huge amount of money to get a specific contract for itself. That's very different. So the way to target this problem is to give candidates who want to run for office without dealing with this system a way to get resources that don't come with the expectation of legislative favors. And that's public financing. They've done it in Arizona, they've done it in Connecticut, they've done it in Maine, they've done it in municipalities. It's not a perfect system because of the Supreme Court case that you're talking about, there's always going to be the ability of somebody who's wealthy to run for office with their own money. So it's not perfect, but it would be a huge, huge step. And I think that what's disconcerting to me is that we have an election now where the Democrats could be running seriously, nationally, on corruption. They have not taken this issue on in a real way, probably because a sizable, although not majority faction of the party doesn't want to take it on. And they could have taken it on in a way that they could have stepped out of the whole system and said, we are for public financing of elections. We are for really cleaning up the system. And the fact that that hasn't happened in light of all these scandals should tell you everything you need to know about how deeply rooted the hostile takeover is.
Okay, we're just about to go to the audience. I want to ask one final question. Recognize we're cutting into that time. If you could be succinct about it. You just said both parties don't want to get off what you regard as a corrupt system, and public financing, which you're outlining as a solution in some form, means everybody in the room has to pay money through some sort of tax. My experience is tax is not a real popular word in the American lexicon. Do you think this is remotely realistic?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that we need to do it through a tax. There's so much money wasted right now. It's incredible. And in fact, the amount of money that we would save with a public financing system would far outweigh the amount of money that we would spend on it. Here's what I mean. We now, every year, there is about $60 billion in congressional earmarks. That's congressmen and senators putting in little provisions for favors, much of the time for lobbyists. That's the Jack Abramoff scandal in a nutshell. Abramoff lobbied members of Congress, give me a contract, put an earmark in, millions and millions of dollars of contracts. If you have a public financing system of elections, you will naturally have far less of that billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of wasteful abuse. So I don't subscribe to the idea that it needs a tax, and I would tell everybody here, and I tell everybody when I talk about this, that we will save so much more money than it would cost to have a public financing system of elections.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Sir.
I grew up thinking that General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were American icons that would never disappear. They're sort of in the toilet right now, and one of the reasons they say they are is that they have such high medical expenses for their employees. I haven't been able to figure out why the boards of directors of those companies haven't been in there lobbying the federal government to get universal medical health care in this country. We spend way more on medical care in this country than other countries do. They have better care.
Can you appreciate that? Can you get to the question?
The question is, how do you feel about it?
Okay, let me just so that people heard, it was GM, the auto industry's in trouble. They're complaining about high health care costs. Why aren't they lobbying to change universal health care as more cost effective? And did David have any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is that you're absolutely right. Is that, at this point, the fact that we've gutted the social safety net in this country and or not expanded it in terms of health care is now an economic liability to our country. It's much cheaper for a car to be produced in Canada, where they have a national healthcare system, than it is to be produced here. So that it is a liability now for us. Why haven't the executives at these companies used their massive lobbying clout to push this? I think they're starting to. Now, because they're in crisis. A better question is, really an interesting question is, why has it taken them so long? And that really it's a cultural issue. We are talking about a culture, and it's an overused phrase, but there is a culture of corruption. It's a way of thinking. When we use the word culture, it's almost like you're implying it's something that's so pervasive that it's almost invisible to those who are in the culture. So among the power players in the political process, this is a culture of corruption. The idea of using government power to crack down on healthcare profiteering, to expand healthcare to everybody, that is the antithesis of or unimaginable to those who are in a system where the health industry has a huge amount of clout by virtue of the millions and millions of dollars it spends getting its way in the political process. But I think this is about to change.
I would just make an editorial comment for what it's worth. I think the culture is not, the culture that you point out is not necessarily a corrupt culture. The culture may be, we've become so attuned to thinking of private sector solutions. That's the mantra that everybody talks about.
Yeah.
The concept that the government could actually deliver cost-effective health care is something that takes a while for people to get their head around. You got to do a lot of studying of international data to say, hey, wait a minute, something else seems to be working.
And let me add one really quick thing. You're very right. It also is.
I like it when you say
it also is the, but it's connected, right? The idea that the free market is the best thing in all cases. That whole concept, I would argue, was developed through massive amounts of money being put into think tanks, candidates, political parties to push that out there. The data is easy on healthcare to see. I mean, it's a joke. It's a complete joke. You look at Medicare. Medicare's administrative costs are 4 cents on the dollar. The administrative cost for your dollar in your healthcare plan for your employer is somewhere between 13 and 16 cents per dollar. So the whole idea that the free market, the unregulated market, is more efficient at delivering, in this case, healthcare, but everything, it's just not as paradigmatic as everybody makes it out to be.
Abe?
Most of the discussion that we are exposed to concerning public finances elections assumes the reason you have to have the money is to pay the media. And for me, the irony is it seems that the media has been one of the most effective lobbyists. You have to pay for your political ads in advance. There's no control over it. They can charge you whatever they want at any time. They can change their charge. So I'm not sure I have a position on controlling the media.
How about a question?
But that's not discussed enough. What do we do about it?
Okay, what do we do about the media and the cost of media, and the media itself is a major lobbying force against corporate or campaign reform?
I'll take off my ideological hat here for a second and put on my political strategist hat, if you will. I think that the media lobby is so powerful. I mean, the National Association of Broadcasters is so powerful that what you have to do in politics, you could write a whole book about how politics is the history of getting one set of corporations to gang up against another set of corporations. Okay, to get public financing of elections, I believe you need to get the broadcasters and the media with you because it is a subsidy for them. That's what it is, in a vacuum. And that the next step after that, once you get that system in place, is to lower the cost of that system by saying that when the public gives media companies FCC licenses for the airwaves, that comes with some sort of responsibility. Right now, we give these FCC licenses to TV stations and the media, and we don't ask for anything in return, like, let's say, reduced rate television ads. And frankly, this was some of the rationale behind people like Ted Kennedy supporting the Medicare Part D bill. His theory was, yes, I'll support the Medicare Part D bill for pharmaceuticals, even if the pharmaceutical industry is going to gouge us. Because once the pharmaceutical industry starts gouging us, then we can tweak the program to bring down those prices. His idea was get the foot in the door. So I believe that with public financing, you've got to get your foot in the door. If you antagonize too many people trying to get this, like something as powerful as the National Association of Broadcasters, you'll never get out of the gate.
It's interesting to hear David talk about being careful about not antagonizing too many people with the title of that book. How about a question from a woman here? We've got all males talking, and I'm not into a mechanical formula here, but ma'am, this will be the last question.
Is there any progress on bringing back the fairness doctrine?
Could everybody hear that? Any progress on bringing back the fairness doctrine?
I have not seen substantial progress on that. I think there are members of Congress who talk about it. What's interesting is that the whole media reform debate is really in a defensive posture right now. There were rules about media consolidation, how much one company could own, how many different media outlets could one company own in a given market. Those were attempted to be gutted. There's the net neutrality issue where telecom companies versus essentially media companies. So I haven't heard a lot about the fairness doctrine being brought back. I think people are sympathetic to it, but I think that the media issue is in such a defensive posture right now. There's more and more consolidation. I think before we ever get to the fairness doctrine, right? The fairness doctrine is basically saying, essentially stipulates that the bigger problem is more that we're not getting both sides in the coverage rather than who owns the entire system. You will never, ever, ever get fair coverage of an issue like, for instance, trade, globalization, the biggest economic issue our country, arguably our world faces in this, you'll never get fair coverage on a network like NBC, which is owned by GE. Never. You will never ever get that. Because ultimately the whole idea that company is objective. It cannot be objective if it is owned by something that has specific goals. The whole concept of objectivity is you don't have your own personal motives. GE, which owns NBC, has very clear motives. GE doesn't want to clean up the Hudson River up in upstate New York. GE wants to be able to sell its products to China, so it doesn't care if those trade deals don't have labor, human rights, and environmental standards. So the fundamental question with the media I think we need to be focusing on is who owns these companies? How do we prevent too much consolidation? How do we demand that if, even in this consolidated media world, that the airwaves which we, the public, own are not given away for free, and we demand that those who we give the privilege of using our airwaves to actually do something to benefit society, provide society at least some return.
Thank you very much, Ben Stiller, for standing in.
Thanks for doing that.